Looks like a couple of you were ready to go. That's great. We'll give people a couple minutes. I always try to open a little bit early so that we can get started pretty on time, since it can take a second for people to register before they can get in. And now there is, I think, even a password on these. But it looks like quite a few of you figured it out, so that's great. All right. Hopefully everyone's having a great afternoon. Looks like people are still coming in, so we'll get started in about a minute. So grab a snack or your lunch, your water bottle. All right. So we'll do kind of a slow start because it looks like a couple people are still trickling in, but I want to respect your time for those of you that are joining me today. So some of you may have come last week, some of you maybe weren't able to. That's great either way. There will be some things I'll mention in this webinar that we talked about last webinar, so you can always go back and watch that one if you want to dive a little bit deeper. But before we start, and while we're kind of waiting for a couple people to come in, let's just start with a quick poll for those of you that are willing to do that. We did some of these last time, but it's always nice to see who's here. So we started with the same one, but are you A? So it's always good to see where you're at in the high school process. It's great. Awesome. All right, again, kind of runs the spectrum, but surprised and so proud of all of you freshmen and sophomores who are joining in. Like I said last time, you're going to be so much more ahead of the process than I ever was. So proud of you. All right. Okay, so we'll jump on in. For those of you that haven't met me yet, my name is Melody Ferguson. I'm the Associate Dean of Admission at Pacific Lutheran University, and I've been working in college admission for about 18, 19 years. So I have lots of experience. I haven't just worked at PLU, I've worked at a few schools. So I'm hoping that I have enough knowledge to share with you in these short webinars to at least give you a little bit more confidence as you head into this process of applying to college. So last week, we covered kind of a broad, how do you even narrow down your choices to decide where to apply? This one is now that you've made those decisions about where to apply, potentially, sorry about that, then how do you land in the yes pile? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So hopefully that's what you showed up for. And again, I will try to post this video on YouTube for those of you that have to leave early or have technical difficulties, or for those people who were unable to attend. All right, let's get started. If it works, there we go. Oops, went too far. All right, so we're going to start with the fact that there are exceptions to every rule. So what I've done is I've tried to look at the universities that I know about that are across the nation and take those top things, items that every college application seems to require or at least talks about in some way. So we're going to talk about those top 5. We're going to use the acronym TREAT to help guide our webinar today. So we'll talk about transcripts, recommendation letters, essays, application, and test scores. At least a general sense of all of these things and what someone in an admission office might be looking for. So kind of pull back that curtain a little bit on college admission and allow you that opportunity to learn a little bit more. All right, so let's start with T is for transcript. Actually, I want to go back real quick. So I'm going to launch another poll because I'm just curious. So what part of the application process, now that you know we're going to talk about those and maybe you know nothing about them, but what part kind of makes you the most nervous, or is the part you for some reason just think is going to be the hardest? I have an assumption, but it's going to allow me to maybe spend a little bit more time on that part of this presentation. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, I figured the essay would win, which is why next week we're going to just talk about the essay. So this will be a little bit of a wading in, but we'll go a lot deeper next week. But glad to hear there's some other people that are nervous about the application, test scores, great. So we'll talk about all of those things as we go. Thanks for sharing. All right. So if we're going to talk about the transcript, which no one picked, but I would like to tell you all, this is probably one of the parts of the application we spend the most time on. So I think that always surprises people because I think, they're like, oh, that my GPA is on there. That's what they're looking for. Well, yeah, we are looking at your GPA, but that's just one factor of what we're looking at. So one of the things we're looking at is something called grade trend. So grade trend means a lot of things. It can mean that maybe you transitioned from middle school to high school and that ninth grade year was a little rocky. It wasn't your best for a variety of reasons. That transition can be hard. Well, we're going to look at how you did in ninth grade, and maybe you progressed, got a little bit better in 10th grade, did a little bit better in 11th grade. That's a positive grade trend. We like that. What makes us nervous sometimes is a negative grade trend or a downward grade trend. So maybe that's you started really strong in high school and we saw that kind of dip down. Now, there are reasons for that. Sometimes we can tell what those reasons are. You started taking harder courses. We're going to look at rigor of coursework. So did you start taking AP classes or IB classes, honors, pre-AP, pre-IB, all of those things that you can take? We're going to look at that. We like to see what's going on. We see grades through freshman, sophomore, and junior year. We don't usually see your senior year grades because you're applying to college usually in the fall of your senior year. And so there's no grades yet. So that does mean that that junior year can be really important as a kind of final impression. There are schools that are what's called rolling admission, which we'll talk about in a little bit, where you can send a test or a transcript in the mid-year, so you can actually get that first semester your senior year. And if you're someone who really wants that last semester to kind of make a difference, find the schools that are willing to take that either before you apply, after you apply, or while you're applying. So we're kind of looking at all of those things. One of the things I want all of you to know, whether you're a freshman, sophomore, or junior, even a senior, is that we are going to take COVID-19 into account for all of you. So for about the next 3 years, maybe 4 if this happens again, we're going to be making note of that this semester of college or of high school was different. And for some of you, you're doing fantastic. Working at home is going okay. You're able to learn very well independently. You have really checked in with your teachers. For some of you, this is not the way you choose to learn. And that's okay too. We get it. There's been a lot of conversation amongst VPs, vice presidents, and directors of admission who are really gonna give a lot of grace for this semester. So whether that's that you had pass-fail courses and you passed all of them, but that's not gonna help your GPA, or whether that's, you didn't get the grades that you were used to getting because this learning environment wasn't right for you, or you had so much else on your plate during this time. So I want everyone to know and kind of take a deep breath. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We understand that this semester is different. So we are going to take that into account. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit as we go as it relates to test scores and the application as well. So make sure you just know that. It'll be noted on most transcripts, and applications have a counselor report where they will also kind of reflect those changes that happened at your specific school, because it's different from state to state and even from school to school. Some schools are going to look at your weighted GPA and some are not. We talked about this a little in the last session, but basically if you've taken some of those rigorous courses, we're going to bump your GPA up for each of those courses that you take. So that means the GPA we're using to consider you for admission and for scholarships might be different than the one that's on your application. But like I said at the beginning, not every school uses a weighted GPA. So it's something you have to ask. And then some schools, you need to make sure you have a copy of your unofficial transcript kind of next to you when you're applying, because they'll actually have you self-report your classes and your grades versus turning in a transcript. Every high school has a different way of submitting transcripts to colleges. So just know what your high school kind of requires of you when you get to your senior year to let them know that you need a transcript sent, if that school requires it. With self-reported schools, University of Washington, Seattle is one of those places, and a lot of students in Washington do apply there. They don't even want to receive your transcript. They just want that self-reported section of your application. So this is where you're going to start to see there are nuances between applications. So just take your time, walk through each application, and make sure you're not making assumptions that something is required for one school and so it's required for another. But generally speaking, we're looking at grade trend, junior year courses, senior year course selection, and what types of courses you did over time. One of the other things we know on a transcript is sometimes you're great in all of your subjects, but there's one subject that's just not your thing, right? You're not an English student, you're not a science student, right? And we can see that consistently your grades are here, but in that class your grades are good, they're just not quite as great. That usually is something we consider as well. So just know there's a person reviewing that transcript. It's not just the number at the bottom. But this is also where I use that tool in my last presentation to see what your chances are of getting into a school based off GPA or test score, those kind of things. So you are applying to schools where you have a chance of being admitted. It looks like someone put a question in the question and answer box, which is awesome. Good, you didn't miss anything. Oh, packing for a camping trip, that sounds fun. Don't worry, I will send you this video so you can watch the first part of it, but you didn't miss much. But there is a Q&A section, so feel free to add them as we go. I'll save time at the end to answer those or try to answer them as we go if they make sense. All right, R is for recommendation. So schools have different strategies with this. Some require 1, some require 3, some require none. So it is very different from school to school. So just make sure you're following directions. If a school requires 1 or doesn't give you any sort of guidance on what or who they want the recommendation from, we highly recommend you use a core academic subject teacher. So think English, social studies, science, or math, because those are the teachers who are going to teach you a little bit more similarly to how you're going to be taught in college. So that's a good translation for us in terms of how well you did there, how that teacher talks about you in a classroom. We like to see that. But some are going to want maybe a community recommendation. That's where you can put in a coach or a choir director or somebody like that. Some might want a religious recommendation. There's all sorts of different recommendations people ask for. So just make sure you're following directions when it comes to who they want your recommendation from. Really think about who you should ask. So don't just ask your favorite teacher, although maybe it is your favorite teacher. We love to hear from teachers where maybe you didn't start out really strong in a subject, maybe it was hard for you, but then your second semester grade ended up being so much better than your first semester grade because of changes you made or help you asked for, kind of decisions you made. That's a great story to tell at college, so that might be a great one. Or if there's a subject you struggle with, like I was just talking about, that teacher might actually be your best recommendation, because if you're trying hard, you're doing everything you can, it's just not your subject, that teacher can speak to your kind of grit within a classroom environment. So think about who tells a story about you that a college would like to hear. That might actually be your best recommendation. Make sure you give them plenty of time. Don't ask them to do this night before because it's not going to be as good of a recommendation as it could be. And they're all really busy and they're probably writing more than one recommendation. So this is why it's nice that some of you are doing this early, because you might be able to send it to them, really early on in your senior year, because you're going to need a recommendation. Maybe you just don't quite know where you're going to send it yet. Sometimes it's an official letter. Sometimes it's a form they have to fill out. Follow up with them, make sure they received it and they've sent it, and then make sure you thank them. They are usually so glowing and lovely, and sometimes speak about students in ways that I think family members or even themselves would love to read. I wish that more of you got to actually see what's written about you in a recommendation. So just be thinking about who you might ask. E is for essay, the part most of you said you were a little nervous about. And I think that's so normal. I actually think the hardest part in the essay when you get to your senior year is just starting, because you just are so nervous about it. So next week, we're going to actually spend the whole 30 minutes talking about how to choose a topic, what to write about, how to write it. I'm going to show you examples. So definitely come back next week for those of you that are nervous about this one. But I'm going to give you a couple tips in this session. This is the one part of your application you have 100% control over by the time you get to your senior year. By that point, your grades are what they are. You've joined the clubs you joined. You did the experiences you experienced. Your letter of recommendation you don't have control over besides who you pick. This is where you get to pick that first letter and that last punctuation mark and every kind of moment in between. So I think that's what gives people the most anxiety is it's kind of all on them. But it is the one place that we kind of hear your voice. We get to know you a little bit better because it's a little bit more personal, whereas everything else is a little bit more transactional. So it's important, and that's why some of you are overthinking it. It should say story, not essay. I wish we called it a personal story or personal narrative, not a personal essay or personal statement. Because we don't want you to write your autobiography, can't write about your whole life or your biography, but we want you to write a story from your life, a story that exemplifies a trait you want us to know about or something that was important to you or really impacted who you are now or who you want to be. So usually there's sometimes a moment in your life that might be worth sharing. And sometimes those are big stories. Sometimes those are kind of mundane moments, but that really showcase who you are. And I promise next week I'll give a lot more tips on how to pick a subject because I think that's sometimes the hardest part. Grammar, punctuation, spelling, they all do matter because they can distract from your story, but they're not the whole thing, right? It's not an English paper that you're turning in. So we do give you some grace in that, but do let someone else edit it, read it out loud to see if it sounds natural because again, it's your voice. And don't use it to just tell us everything else you've already told us in your application. Tell us something new. Use the opportunity to tell us something about yourself we haven't already read or to dive deeper into one of those areas. Different schools spend a different amount of time reading the essays. So schools that get a lot of them actually have kind of a clock and go through them pretty fast. So that's why you need to start strong and finish strong, which we'll talk about next week, and kind of make it skimmable. It doesn't need to be a 5-paragraph essay with a clean introduction and a clean conclusion. It's a story, remember? But those are usually the schools that are getting lots of applications. So you have to think about the bigger colleges like a University of Washington. They may spend, less than a minute on an application. At PLU, we get around 4,000 applications, and we do spend about, anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes reading an application for a student, but we get to spend a bit more time on an application than other schools do. All right, so A is for application. So that's just the nuts and bolts parts of it, as well as the activity section, which someone just asked a question about that, and I'll tell you about that in a second. You have to think about how many. So 1, how much work do you want to do? But 2, sometimes if you get into 14 schools, that makes your process so much harder to decide. So I think that's why last week we talked about narrowing down your choices of even where to apply, because if you've done some of that sorting before you apply, you can apply to maybe a more manageable number to compare once you see where you get in and what your financial aid awards are. And visit, right? So really think of what a good number is for you. The average student is applying to 5 to 7 colleges, they say these days. I don't know if that's going to change in this time, but that's usually kind of where people are at. But some people apply to 3, some apply to 9. Every now and then I get somebody who applies 14. That's too many, I think. But you have to think about how much it costs to apply. There are fee waivers for applications, so definitely ask for those if it's a financial hardship to apply to college. But it's not like it's free to apply to schools, so you can't just apply to everywhere. So it's important to think about that. There are ways to make your life a little bit easier though. So if you haven't heard about the Common Application or the Coalition Application, I would encourage you to Google them. The Common Application, you can Google it and you'll see all the schools that belong to the Common App, as we call it. And it's over 300 or 400 colleges. So you fill out one application and you can apply to a bunch of schools. Now, each school might cost a different amount, so you're still being charged per application, but you only have to fill out one, so it's saving you a lot of time. There might be supplemental parts of the application for some school, but usually they'll be pretty simple, potentially another recommendation or a short response or essay, or maybe just a form you're filling out. So the Common Application is a great way to apply to college if you're looking at more than one school especially, but not every school is a part of the Common Application. Some are a part of the Coalition Application. It's another kind of one application, multiple schools. University of Washington, Seattle, and Bothell are on that one, for example. So that would be an option if you were looking at those schools. But it does mean you might have to actually fill out more than one application because it's not like we all belong to the same application pool. One of the things I do encourage you to look at, there are schools that are free to apply to. I would only encourage you to apply if you're actually interested. Otherwise, you're just going to get a bunch of information you don't want. But like PLU, we don't charge an application fee. So if you're looking for a local school or something about PLU interests you, we would be an easy option to add to your Common Application. There are different dates and deadlines. So every school has a different admission process. So rolling admission, early action, early decision, or what's kind of referred to as one date. Rolling admission, that's the most flexible. There's usually not a deadline. You apply, they let you know as soon as they know. So it's called rolling because it just rolls through your senior year. You kind of apply when you're ready. They might have priority dates or a final deadline that you have to pay attention to, but usually they're pretty flexible in terms of their application process. Early action and early decision are really things you would use if you have one school you're dying to go to, you've already done research, you know it's a good academic, social, financial fit. If you get in, you're going. You should look at early action or early decision because what it does is it tells the school that you're that interested. One of them is binding though, which means that if you apply early decision and a school says you're in, you have to go there. So you have to withdraw from the other schools. So for that one, you need to be pretty serious about your decision. And then one date is like University of Washington. You apply, they have one deadline, they close at midnight, at 12:01 it's too late. So there's no flexibility in their date, and that's kind of the one deadline. So it is really important to start kind of thinking about these dates and working backwards from there so you know how much time it's going to take you to get your recommendation and your essay and pull all of this together so you can get it sent out in a timely fashion. Technology sometimes breaks, so you don't want to be doing this last minute and have your Wi-Fi go out or something like that. So it's sometimes really important for you to get this done a little bit earlier. And then think about grammar, punctuation, and spelling on your entire application, not just your essay. So capitalize your parents' names and what colleges they go to. Think about punctuation if you're writing a sentence. Think about there, and there. So it's really important that you think about this as you look at every part of your application because someone is reviewing not just the essay, but the whole application. Now there's a couple of questions about this next slide. So I'll get there and then I'll go and read those to see if I can answer them. So this is the activity section. This is where you tell us about activities, whether those are through your school or through your community. You tell us about all the things that you do, your hobbies, your passions, your interests. Those are all so important to us to know because we're looking for more than a student. A lot of us are campuses where you're going to live on that college campus. You're going to become a member of that community. And that community is richer when people are coming in and participating in the non-school activities as much as the school activities. So it doesn't mean you have to be involved in 17 things. We're just looking for commitment and leadership. So something that you stuck with over your 4 years of high school and maybe built yourself into some leadership positions or running things. It doesn't have to be ASB president or captain of a sports team. It can be kind of unofficial leadership as well, like leadership in your community, doing a lot of community service, working and maybe becoming shift manager or opening for somebody, you know, the kind of responsibility that's given for that. don't sell yourself short and don't assume we know something. So let's use a sport, for example. So say you're a swimmer. You might put swimming 4 years and then just leave the rest of it blank. But what I know about swimmers is they tend to swim for the school. They maybe also swim for a club team. That's 2 separate listings. They're probably a lifeguard at a pool. They might teach swim lessons. You start to see they might have done community service or travel through that swimming experience potentially. So swimming actually has a lot of activities, same with baseball or soccer or even music and theater. So think about all the things. Don't just put swimming 4 years. But really kind of parse that out and make the nuances of that so we can see what the actual commitment was to that activity, that passion, that hobby, whatever it is. So if you were finding yourself where your brain is blank and you only are listing one thing, this is where people in your life can sometimes actually be great resources. So if you have a really close teacher, mom and dad, aunt and uncle, best friend, ask them, hey, what have I done in my 4 years of high school, my 3 years of high school? And you'd be surprised at the things that they share with you that maybe you forgot about. So make sure that you're really putting all those things in, even if you think it's silly. Did you teach yourself to play guitar on YouTube during this pandemic? Put it there, because we'd rather know than not know. One question was, what if, I'm really involved in a spring sport and it was canceled this spring? Again, we totally get it. So put your plans on there, right? So if you're a sophomore right now and you are going to put soccer for 4 years, but this spring you weren't able to play, still put that you were going to play this spring, right? Still put the 4 years. We're going to understand that this spring was a different circumstance than before. So I promise you that none of us are going to hold your inability to do an activity or extracurricular activity against you from this spring. Let's see what other ones are in there. Do you have to participate in sports to show how a well-rounded applicant? No. So again, it's what activities are you passionate about, not your friend or someone else. So not everyone is an athlete, but if you are athletic, obviously that would count. What if you wanted to do a spring sport? So just let us know that that was your intention or your plan. And obviously if you can do it again next year, then you would be able to put that on the same line. We'll talk about that essay one in a second. All right, I hope that helped a couple of you. So think of it as your brag sheet. We're taught as young children not to boast or brag, right? That's not appropriate. But this is the time to tell us how great you are, because if you don't tell us, we don't know. All right. T is for test score. Actually, yeah. So most schools will take the SAT or ACT. Most of us do not have a preference, so we take whichever one works best for you. Last I looked, I think there were 2 schools in the whole nation that had a preference, so it's very few. So just take the one that works best. There's practice tests online. They do tests differently. I will tell you that for the next 3 years, things might shift when it comes to test scores, but for sure, for those of you that are juniors, rising seniors, quite a few schools have gone test optional for next year. Some forever will be test optional, some just for next year. So for those of you that are freshmen or sophomores, you'll have to watch those schools to see if they continue being test optional or not. Probably going to depend on how this impacts our future. So that's great for you. It's going to mean you have a choice. So what test optional means is you can still send your SAT or ACT, but you don't have to. And if you did send it, but you're not happy about it, most of us will have a part on the application that says, would you like to be considered test optional? And if you check yes, we will not use that test score, even if you sent it to us. So just know that this is one of those that, again, we totally get it. So in the normal world, before all of this, we would have said take one your junior year, and then if you like your score, great, you're done. If you don't love your score, take it again your senior year. For some of you, that's not an option potentially. So you might only get to take it once in the fall, and you won't know if you like that score or not. That's okay. I'd still encourage you to take it because there are still some schools out there who are not test optional, and some are test optional for admission, but not for scholarships. So you might still want to take it just so you have it. But if we say we're test optional, it does not look bad if you don't send your test score at all. It doesn't count against you. We don't assume that your test score was poor. Some students just don't want to send their tests because they don't believe it shows who they are as a student. PLU, which is the school I work for, Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. Someone asked what that is. I should probably say that. We're a school who has been test optional for a few years. And for me, I'm more concerned with how well you've done over your years of high school than how you do on a random Saturday. It's not detrimental to not send that test score. If a school says they're test optional, take them at their word. So for those of you that are freshmen or sophomores, do think about taking it in your junior year if that's an option. Should you take them more than once? Depends on what that score is like, depends on where you're applying. Some schools super score. So what that means is they take your highest, say for the SAT math section, and your highest evidence-based reading and writing section, even if those are from two different scores, and put them, or two different tests, and put them together. So for those schools, it might be worth it to take it more than once. SAT and ACT are both planning to offer these in the fall more often than they did before, not just once a month. And they're both looking at options for at-home exams. So just expect that for those of you that are rising seniors, that there's just going to be some options and some choices. Yeah. So hopefully that answered the question. If a school that you want to go to does require a score, you'll have to sign up for one of those summer or fall exams. And again, if they're not able to do them in person, they're going to have at-home options. Great questions. So when I get to the end of all of those, 5 main things, we're going to talk about a few options here in a second, but there are exceptions to every rule. Not every school has the same way to apply, even if they're on the Common Application. So it's really important that you consider that moving forward, that these are the basics, but now you have to really dig into those schools that you're looking at and figure out what their needs are when it comes to applying to their school. So use some of those tools I gave you last time, but also remember that you can get in. So I always put this in all my presentations because I just want people to know it's a lot easier to get into college than you think. So although we're making you go through all these steps, we are trying to admit you. We're not trying to deny you. So really give us that reason to kind of say yes, right? You're deciding where to apply. You're deciding what to put in your application, and you're deciding where to go. Expressed interest is something that kind of creeped up in college admission a few years ago maybe now, and that is that some schools, especially competitive colleges, but I think for some schools it's going to be more important this year than it ever has been, is we really give some preference sometimes to students we know are interested in our college. So how do you do that? How do you express an interest in a college? There's a lot of ways, and you're going to find this totally silly, but we send you emails. We can tell if you opened it. We can tell if you clicked on it. Now there's sometimes you can't totally tell, but if you open it and click on it, that's expressed interest. We can see who follows us on Instagram or Facebook or engages with us on social media. We can see who comes for a campus visit or who signs up for a virtual visit, who watches our virtual tours. So there are ways to engage with us even in this virtual environment. And one of those is via email and text. A lot of admission counselors are very accessible at most schools. You can find them on the websites based on your high school or your state, and you can email them with questions or just letting them know you're interested. There's also request information forms on college websites. Yes, you will get email and you will get mail. Some of you probably already are, way too much. But if you're not getting it from the school you want it from, let them know you're interested. So it's really important that you don't just be a passive kind of observer of this college process, but you figure out ways to be actively interested, especially in those schools that are at the top of your list. So yes, I know it's all happening. Last week we talked about building questions to ask. Send those questions to an admission counselor, make them work. And then use the additional information section. So every application has an additional information section, which is for you to write about hardships in your life, things that we can't naturally see on your application. Maybe you had some health issues or a family member pass away during high school and that impacted your grades. This is where you can tell us that, especially if you don't want to write about it in your essay. You will not need to write your essay about COVID-19 and its impact unless you really, really want to, or use the additional information section to talk about COVID-19. Most applications across the United States, the Common Application, for example, has already decided this. There will be a COVID-19 question for at least the next few years that will allow you and your high school counselor to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted you or the school if you want to. If you've done fine and it's no big deal, you don't have to answer the question. But if there's something you'd like us to know about the impact on you or your family, this would be a section that you're able to fill out. So it's an optional part of most college applications. We're going to ask that you take your time, right? So breathe through this, do some, come back to it. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. I'm going to remind you that you're in charge. So really take ownership over this process. And I'm also going to remind you that there's a person like me at every college who is just excited to help you through this process. So use those people to your benefit. I read college essays before people turn them in. I help people with applications. And not even students that are just interested in Pacific Lutheran University, but are also interested in other schools as well. So we know you're usually applying to more than one school. These articles just recently came out in Forbes. And I'll send this to you, remember, so you don't have to write these giant URLs down. But they're called We Get It, which I thought was so great because so many of you juniors, sophomores, and freshmen are really worried about how this spring is going to impact your ability to get into college. And so the writer wrote 3 different articles talking about how schools across the nation, big schools, small schools, are thinking about grades and testing, extracurricular involvement, and summer opportunities, financial aid essays, and recommendations as it relates to this spring. So I'll make sure you get these links because I think it'll help. You're hearing me say it, but I want you to hear it from some of my peers and colleagues across the nation as well. Let's see what sort of questions there are. You guys have been great about asking them. So let's see what's in here. Talked about that one. Talked about that one. What if you want to send a different essay to different schools on the Common App? So generally, if a school wants a very specific essay, they're going to have you write a separate one or have a way for you to do that. There are ways within the Common App to differentiate. You can basically upload your application to a specific school and then go back and edit it to upload to another school. So it's just going to mean your process is a little bit different. Just make sure you don't load in all the schools you want to go to. Load in the schools you want to get that essay, send it, and then go back to it, edit your essay, and then resend it, if that makes sense. So you'll have to kind of send it 2 separate times. We talked about that. Will we get an email to see the next video? Yeah. So I will make sure part of the registration is to put your email address in. So as long as those were typed correctly, you will get an email from me today or tomorrow with a PDF of this presentation. Any of the links will be in the email, and then a note on what next week's is. So next week's is how to write a college essay, and then we'll We'll talk about examples. We'll dive in really deep into the essay. And then that's what we'll talk about next week. So if that's the part that's making you most nervous or any of your friends nervous, definitely come to that session. And if you missed last week's, I'll put a link to that. So there's a giant YouTube. I was hoping it would be shorter when I put it on here on this page, but I will make sure you get that YouTube link in the video or of the video from last week as well in that email. Yeah, I'm trying to send this out to everyone, but some of you I'm finding out about earlier and later, and I know that some of the school districts are sending them out too. So I am recording this and I will put it on that YouTube channel so you can watch last week's, or if you want one of your family members to watch it, you totally can. Do schools look for different essay stories? I would say most of us nowadays, some of us have prompts like specific questions we want you to answer, but if that's becoming a little bit less popular, we really want you to have your voice. So you're gonna find that for most of us, essay of choice, which means you can write about whatever you want, as long as it's about you, is what most students choose. So it really gives you a lot of freedom, which for some of you is really helpful. For some of you, you're like, no, I need more direction. So we'll talk a little bit about how to choose a topic, especially for those essay of choice types of essays next week. But if a school wants a specific essay, it's usually that they want, maybe it's a secondary essay that's really helping them get to know you and how you'll fit into their campus climate. So it's gonna be a little bit more specific. Great questions. I'm really impressed by all of these. All right, any other questions? My email and my phone number is on here. You can use that phone number to call, although I don't answer all the time because we're kind of separate from our phone, but you can also text. I do get my text on my computer. So definitely feel free to do that. I had a few of you do that after the last session, which was great, and we were able to follow up. If you're someone that likes an in-person conversation a little bit more, we can do a Zoom meeting, which you can schedule with that link, that Calendly link that is connected directly to my calendar and my Zoom account. So I'm more than happy to meet with you or your family, or just talk via email or text between now and when we actually get to see each other in person. Just to end, for those of you that came in late, I'm Melody Ferguson, Associate Dean of Admission at Pacific Lutheran University. And I do live out here in Bonney Lake, Washington. So I know quite a few of you are tuning in from there as well. But that is where I'm broadcasting live. If any of you went to Mountain View Middle School, they're doing a parade today. So I encourage you to step outside and wave to your former teachers. And if any of you went to Lake Ridge and had Mr. Ferguson, he is my husband. So, you know, it's kind of funny how connected the world can be for some students. So I appreciate you joining me. I went a little over this time, but it was a lot to go through and you had great questions. And again, I'm not related to Chris Ferguson, but we get that all the time. But he's a PLU fan, so we're friends. But I know it's so funny, two Mr. Fergusons. So join me next week. Thank you so much for coming, and I appreciate all of you joining me. Have a great, great Wednesday. Talk to you later.